Our last conversation today will be moderated by Times Deputy Managing Editor, Michael Elliott.
Nice to see you for our last session of the day, which is called Hotspots and Opportunities. And we've sort of decided in the green room that a hotspot is a good thing, is an opportunity, rather than a bad thing. I'm joined with a stellar cast of characters who can walk us through an overview of opportunities in the global economy as we close this afternoon's session. You can read their detailed bios. You don't need to hear from me, but we have Rob Davies, Minister of Trade and Industry from the Republic of South Africa, our partner in this conference. We're thrilled to see you. Maria Ramos, Group Chief Executive for Absa Group, also from South Africa, returning to South Africa. Next to Maria, my old friend Ian Goldin from Oxford University, former Senior Executive at the World Bank, and of course at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Immediately next to me, an even older friend of mine, Ken Courtis, many significant roles in the private financial sector, wonderful economist, and now with themes in Hong Kong. And a huge delight, pleasure, and honor for me for the first time in my life, and I've done this many, many times, to be at a session where I'm moderating Hernando de Soto, who for more than 20 years has had some of the keenest, sharpest, and most original insights on what really makes economies grow and on how the benefits of capitalism can be spread from the world which was used to them to the one which was not. We're going to have to be extremely tight and extremely sharp and succinct in our answers. And all I can say is that if the panel is not, I've brought a vuvuzela.
Let me blow it.
I'd just like to say I know how to use it. I had plenty of practice at the Holland-Cameroon game the other night, so Ken, you're warned, okay?
You can see it's Holland, right?
Exactly. Rob, let me start with you. You've written quite a lot in the last year as the global recession kind of took a grip on the way in which South Africa's traditional markets in the European Union, above all, were looking slightly parlous, and that there was an enormous opportunity for South Africa to diversify its economy into a more south-south orientation, taking advantage of markets in the developing world. And that gives us the perfect opportunity, it seems to me, to think about the extent to which the new global opportunity is a South opportunity. So just a few minutes on that, a few words on that.
Well, thanks very much. I think that the trend was actually evident before the recession, that we were seeing the rise of important forces in the world economy, and I think that what's happened with the recession is that has only been accelerated. In fact, probably what we can say is that, as I've put it on a few occasions, we've seen a seismic shift in the world economy. I think the tectonic plates have shifted in quite dramatic ways. And so, the dynamic economies of the world are in the larger developing countries, in China, in India, in Brazil, but also in Africa. And that I think, South Africa are standing at a very important kind of crossroads. We are part of Africa. We're also part of that other grouping of countries. And it's not just an opportunity, it's actually an imperative that we begin to diversify and shift, because unfortunately, the continued impact of the crisis, and we can use this term hotspots in different ways, but the hotspots for us in trading right now are difficulties which we are encountering in some of our established marketplaces of the North, arising from the still depressed demand, and then the devaluation of currencies, which is taking place as a result of the debt crises that's taking place in those countries. And I mean, depending on how the debates in the G20 pan out, this balance that has to be struck between fiscal consolidation and not withdrawing the stimulus package, I mean, that can have further enormous consequences. But certainly South-South trade is important to us for those reasons, but also for one other reason, which I will just sketch very briefly, and that is that we are all developing countries, and we have a common experience as developing countries of the problems and challenges of development. And I think at least in some cases, like in the structure of IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, we have a relationship that's rooted in extensive cooperation, functional cooperation across a number of fields, and it gives us, I think, a very, very solid basis on which to structure trade agreements of a different kind. We've concluded one with SACU and Mercosur, and we're in the process of negotiating another one at this moment with India. So I think for all of these reasons, these are very, very important priorities for us.
Maria, can I bring you in to follow up on that? I mean, you've watched the development of the South African economy and the African economy and the world economy more generally from a number of different standpoints. I mean, do you share Rob's optimism that there are real opportunities out there in areas and countries of the world which have not had the focus in the past?
Well, absolutely, and I think I obviously feel strongly that the opportunities are on this continent, and Rob spoke about shifting tectonic plates, and if you want an indication or a measurement of that, you know, if you think about the U.S. economy, currently it's 3 times larger than the Chinese economy, but you have to remind yourself that 10 years ago, that was 9 times larger than the Chinese economy. On this continent, in the earlier session, we had a very brief discussion about rating agencies. You know, 10 years ago, you would be hard-pressed to count on one hand the number of African countries who actually had ratings. Today, there are 22 countries on the continent that have ratings, with all the difficulties associated with ratings. 17 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. What that's an indication of is countries and more companies having access to capital markets and being able to fund themselves in that space. So yes, I think there are significant opportunities, and those opportunities are actually right here, right in this continent. And I would say the opportunities come out of 3 hotspots, and we have chosen to think about hotspots in a very positive way. They're about people. You know, people both in terms of the size of this market, but also in terms of the fact that people provide talent and a fantastic and fertile environment for development. They're about infrastructure and a growing infrastructure. And I suppose, as we heard earlier in the President's address, I hope that what we've been able to show and to prove as a continent, that we have the capacity and we have a growing infrastructure, not just in this country, but across the continent. And the other very important part of it is innovation. And I know that we, hopefully in the panel, will be able to talk about innovation a bit more. But innovation is the driving force to sustainability in my mind. And so I think we have great opportunities on all 3 fronts.
I very much want to pick up the innovation point in a second, and I'll bring Hernando in at that point. But Ian, it is a natural thing at the beginning of a conference like this to be optimistic, to say there are opportunities out there, there's huge potential out there. Africa and other places in the developing world have enormous potential markets, sources of innovation, and so on. But wait a sec. Are we out of the wood yet? We've gone through the worst economic recession for 70 years. Is it time for us to start looking at fresh opportunities, or should we still be worried?
Well, I think the really good news for the world is that there is Africa, there is Asia, and the other emerging markets, and they're going to save the world. They're going to do that because they didn't make the huge policy mistakes that the rich countries have made. And in some respects, they're much better governed. The reason why there's a Greek crisis is because the Greek government hadn't been clean with the European Commission about the level of its deficit. Something as simple and fundamental as that. There's a severe danger, though. There is bad news. The rich countries have fired all their fiscal bullets. There's absolutely nothing left to fire. And so one has to say, is there going to be another crisis that there needs another bailout for? Our government's going to have to step in again. And one can think of a whole series of reasons short term and also medium term why that may be the case. It also is absolutely the case that there's a danger of a double-dip recession coming out of the depth of some of the cutbacks. The level of cutbacks in a number of countries have never been seen before. And so we don't know how the markets will perform. We don't know how consumers will react to this. And there is a severe danger. And it's particularly, as I say, dangerous because we don't have more ammunition and ideas.
And I'm assuming that the scale of the fiscal rebalancing and the cutbacks is very much on the agenda at the G8, G20 discussions in Canada this weekend, right?
Yes, with different countries obviously taking a different stance, and it's part of the transatlantic divide. I think it'll be fine for now, but as we've seen and has been talked about earlier today, the markets are very fickle.
Sure.
And if they turn against and the spreads widen much further, we could get into a very nasty downward spiral.
Ken, time to get excited about new global opportunities, or time, as Ian reminds us, to continue to be worried about a double-dip recession and the sense that we might not be out of the woods yet?
You know, I'm with the Pied Piper of global economics here. This crisis, as I see it, has smashed the equilibrium that was in place for managing the world economy since the breakup of Bretton Woods. Completely smashed it. And we have no idea what the new equilibrium is going to be yet. We don't even know how long this transition is going to last, nor what tricks it still holds for us. I think it holds a lot of tricks for us. The issue is not government debt. Government debt, in many ways, is a side story. The real issue for the developed economies is the unwinding of a 30-year buildup of gross debt, of which the main culprits were in the private sector, right? It's financial sector debt and household debt, which is driving this, drove that debt cycle. And so in virtually all the developed economies, with some exceptions, the gross debt levels now are running around 400% of GDP. You know, when Clinton handed over to Bush, it was around 250% of GDP in the US. So you have to ask yourself, take the UK, we're almost at 500% gross debt levels. You have to ask yourself, how much debt can a developed economy carry? Is it 2 times GDP? Is it 2.5, 3, 4? It's probably not 4, 4.5, right? It's probably closer to 2.5. So we're going to have to see that contraction. And what do you do when you have a crisis of debt, a Himalaya like that crushing down on you? Well, you can grow yourself out of it, but the jihadists against government debt, who are now looking like they're dominating government thought in developed economies, they risk driving us back into a new recession. And with this type of debt level, a new recession is going to be really poisonous in the circumstances you just described, where governments have no bullets left. You could default, and that's happening on a wide scale, and I believe we'll continue over the next several years to see defaults, private sector and public defaults masked in one way or another. You could inflate, but you can't really inflate in this environment where so much has gone wrong. The multiplier effect is not working. The banking sector isn't creating credit properly. You could tighten your belt. You know, that's going to, or in the lucky few, they can devalue. So I think that this crisis is far from over. I think equity markets have not bottomed. I think what we saw in March 2009 was a bottom. We've corrected off there, but I would be very surprised that were we to meet a year from now if equity markets are not substantially lower than they are today. I think the real opportunities in this world are, of course, in the emerging markets. This crisis has accelerated dramatically the secular shift to the emerging markets. It's knocked, also it's this acronym we have of the BRICS. Well, this crisis has knocked the R out of the BRICS. Russia's proved itself incapable of taking the rents from its commodity production and recycling them into long-term infrastructure that enhances productivity. So this is being driven by the BRICS, by Africa, by Indonesia. That's where the growth dynamics are. These are the countries that have, on the whole, low levels of leverage. These are countries that all have huge amounts of pent-up domestic demand. We just heard about infrastructure. We heard about people, the demographics of these countries. So that's where the growth is. But this is not going to be easy. Just see how quickly political leaders are being ejected. You saw Rudd last week in Australia. You see how Obama's in trouble. You see what's going on in France. So this is going to be a very rocky ride, and we're going to have to keep our seatbelts on.
Africa, Brazil, India, China, Indonesia, Abiki. I'm actually trademarking it, so you can all use it. I'd like a little bit of credit. Hernando, we've seen the worst global recession for 70 years. And what I want to ask you is this. As you hear these conversations about whether it's going to continue, whether we should get used to a double dip, what opportunities that there are out there, do you think enough creative and original thinking on how to structure and develop economies is going on? Or do you think that we are missing an opportunity that, as it were, the greatest recession for 70 years has presented us with to really think outside the box?
Well, I think this recession is really going to give us the opportunity to find out what capitalism is and what made it so successful. I'm not convinced that Western countries yet know it. You know, I read books like Samuel Huntington, whom I admire very much, and they say something about the Anglo-Saxon spirit or about Protestantism. I don't think you've got it. Right. I think the reason why it was all able to hang together, and that was the concern from Adam Smith to Marx, was how ignorant we humans were, how we didn't connect to reality, and how we needed instruments to connect to reality. And what I think you Europeans and Americans have done over about a century and a half is actually created the best documented legal system in the world. You know where everything is, where every house is,
who owns it, right?
Right? But that was done by a series of very anonymous people who didn't write many books, but they built it over the 19th century. What's happened now, since, as you know, I study shadow economies, is that you have now created the world's largest shadow economy, and it's called derivatives. You actually, I mean, you remember Secretary Paulson, sometime September 2008, says, I need $780 billion from the US Congress because we have troubled assets reform program. And they're non-performing. These mortgages, which have gone 16 generations into all sorts of newfangled, basically property paper, because it one way or other refers to the underlying asset. You'll remember then, Michael, about 3 weeks later, he says, by the way, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the Gordon Brown way. We're not going to buy these troubled assets. We're going to invest in the banks. Now, one of the advantages I have, but not being a well-known journalist and coming from a marginal country like Peru, is that people talk to me because it doesn't really matter what I think or say. So I went to the United States, where I have very high-level friends, and say, what happened to Paulson? Why didn't he go and buy it? And he said he couldn't find them. And then Chris Cox brings out afterwards the statistics and says, you know, these derivative instruments are about $600 trillion. The GNP of the United States is $15 trillion. All of us together, the BRICS, the South Africans, the Indians, Peruvians, we all make $60 trillion a year. And you've got now $670 trillion of paper that nobody really knows exactly where it is, where the rules of the market no longer apply. You've taken away mark-to-market. You've found double ways of doing double bookkeeping and all of that. And all of a sudden, you start looking like slumdogs and millionaires, which is you go to Davies, where I was just there, introduced by Prime Minister Singh, who asked me to look at it. And I went and I asked the lady of government, how many people are here? That was where the big slum in Mumbai. She said, well, you know, it's about 400,000. And then I asked the head of the organization, who said, no, we're no less than 3 million. That reminded me of a conversation with President Obasanjo of Nigeria some time ago, where he said, what would it take for you to bring our shadow economy to the legal economy? I said, well, I'll do the studies. You'll be the people who are going to be able to take it there. He said, but, you know, how much would it cost? I said, well, I don't know. I mean, you're a big country, 120 million people. And he said, well, 120 million, 180 million, somewhere there. All right, here's it. We of the developing world are large shadow economies, and we don't have all the facts. But now you've got the mother of the ignorance of all the facts. And until that crisis is recognized as a crisis of knowledge, an epistemological crisis where you don't really know how much paper you've got out there in relation to assets, this is going to continue until you blow it all up.
So, Rob, let me... a resonant point. So, Rob, let me ask you to directly to follow up Hernando's thought directly. Should you, in the emerging world, just have lost confidence completely in economic management in the rich world, the developed world, the OECD world? I mean, do you look at the last 2 years and you think, these guys have been giving us lectures for years, and they've created this shadow economy of derivatives, and all right, you're nodding your head, so now tell us.
Well, I think that the policy advice that we've got over many, many years, I think, has been shown to be pretty threadbare. I think that we've got a major crisis in the economics profession. The policy advice has manifestly not solved the crisis, and also I think the analysis of the crisis has tended to underestimate the extent of it. I think what everybody has said here, I think it would be quite interesting to maybe want to do it. Just ask everybody here who thinks there's a real danger of double-dip recession. And I'm asking you that because when I was in Davos earlier, I was one of the panels at the beginning of the year, and they said, who thinks there's going to be double-dip recession? Hardly anybody. Everybody thought we were out of it. And I think that, you know, there are some very, very, very serious challenges. I think that the point is that we are still one world. So we don't want to say we can just let the rich world just go off and you know, fall into the sea or something. It doesn't work like that. What happens in the rich world impacts on all of us. And I think if they take the wrong decisions and they, you know, the stimulus packages are pulled too soon, the history of the Great Depression tells us that was a major decision that led into the Great Depression. We will all be affected. But I think that the good news is that within this picture, there are poles of economic dynamism. They happen to be in the developing world, in the, whatever your acronym was, I've forgotten it.
ABICI.
ABICI. In that nexus, that's where the poles are. And if you've got 500% debt, why on earth does anybody want to invest in any you know, stocks, let alone derivatives in those places? Come and invest in places where there's real value. So I think that's probably one of the key messages.
But Maria, you were sort of nodding as Ian and Ken were doing the slightly doom-laden prognosis. I caught you kind of ruefully, as it were, silently agreeing. Do you worry?
Yes, I do worry. I worry because I think it's, you know, I think it is too early to say that we are out of danger. I think there are signs that there is recovery. We've seen some recovery in the United States, for example. But what's clearly what we see happening in Europe is serious and difficult to deal with. So it's, you know, I have a deep concern that we have underestimated just how deep and structural the recession has been, and therefore it will take quite a long time to get out of it. Right. That what we're talking about is a major rebuild of some key parts of the global economy, that you can't deal with massive structural debt problems in the developed world by simply cutting the deficit for a year or two. These are not small adjustments over a short period of time, because we're not talking just about the flow. We're also talking absolutely about the stock of debt over a long, and that's going to take big changes and big adjustments. And it is just as well that we are seeing that we have the developing countries growing and providing some impetus to the global economy. And I am reminded of Bob Zulik's speech earlier on this year, where he pointed, when he made I think a very good point, that we have to stop talking about developing and developed countries and North and South and East and West, that those are just points on a compass. They're not economic, you know, they're not economic destinations. They that's all they are, and the world has changed and is changing quite dramatically. And I think the other thing it does mean is that the conversations, I think, amongst political leaders in the big fora, like the G20, are changing and have changed. And I think that's important.
Ian, come on in, and then I want to bring Hernando back.
Three very brief points. I mean, the first is, I think it's wrong to say that the policy advice was wrong. A lot of it was good, and we listened to it in the emerging markets about getting your macro house in order, controlling inflation, bringing down debt, and that's why we're in much better shape. The problem was the rich countries didn't listen to their own advice, and they wouldn't even allow the inspectors of the IMF into the Treasury, etc. So when they were there, they ignored them. So it's not that the advice was all wrong, it wasn't. Secondly, the economics profession clearly was bankrupt and is bankrupt, and as an economist, it's mea culpa as much as anyone else. We didn't understand, we still don't understand the real economy, and we rationalized through a nonsense ideology or rational expectations, asset price bubbles and other things. The third thing is that globalization has been incredibly effective at making emerging markets get an opportunity to develop. It is because we are integrated and open that this has happened. It's not despite it. That very same integration brings interdependence, fragility, complexity. And that's why the rich countries matter more than ever to emerging markets. Something that happens in a rich country could really mess up Africa, China, and other places. It might be another financial crisis, it might be something else like a pandemic, but we are integrated, and there's no way that the emerging markets, even though they are going to be the driver for the future, can let the rich countries get on doing bad things.
Hernando, I don't want us to, I'm going to try and get a couple of questions in, but I don't want us to forget Maria's point about innovation. Now, you've been looking at informal economies, developing world economies for many, many years now. And my guess is you have seen extraordinary innovation outside the developed world that, for a variety of reasons, absence of legal systems, property rights, what have you, hasn't been recognized. So could you talk a little bit about just the creativity that you see out there?
Well, I think all human beings are innovative, and we're seeing that more and more. What's happening in South Africa, what's happening in India, the BRICS, what's happening in many Central American countries, for example. There's no doubt about it. What can we do about it? Is we can give it the right institutions. It's like a garden. You create the conditions in which things flourish. Let's have no pretense that we know how it works. We just know that if you've got clear property rights, it works. We know that you will receive investment provided you can issue shares. So the question here for India and Africa and Peru is how many of our population can issue shares? How many of our population are in limited liability or just in tribes? Very different. How many of us have clear property rights? Because if you're going to invest or you're going to loan, how are you going to invest in someone who doesn't have an address or somebody who doesn't own what they have? So that is our real challenge. You get a country like India, which has done fantastic stuff, but that's 10% of the economy. 90% of the economy, there's no property rights, there's no limited liability, there's no possibility to issue shares, there is no capital. Who are the guys who make the investment? Those that have the property rights and then go to a developed market economy and say, look at the property right I've got, and that's what you invest in. So it's not that you've got the money, we've got the rights, and you know how to handle them, and you've abused them. Because now through derivatives, you've created property rights over things that don't exist. Do you know that there are derivatives that are called synthetic derivatives because there's not even an asset behind them? So the basis of your success, which was clear definition of ownership, of who is who, and who's got whose hand in whose pocket, you've lost. And until we in developing countries give that to all our countries, we're not going to innovate as much as we could.
We've got a few minutes left, and it'd be great to, this is a rare panel that you have in front of you, so it'd be great to get some questions. Lady, just here, Mike is running to you really quick, fighting their way through.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, actually, it was, all right, okay.
Michael, thank you very much. Question to the panel. As we're having this dialogue, we are talking in parallel to the G20, talking about stimulus versus austerity. Here we're talking about the need for compassion. My concern is this. We are at a time in the economic crisis where there is underlying intense concern and almost panic. There could be a double dip. There could be something around the corner. Yet, in my mind, one of the greatest bankruptcies that occurred in the last 2 years has been the bankruptcy of conscience. These things have happened because of irresponsibility, because of excess. Is it actually possible, at a time when we are in a state of fringe panic around recovery and the impatience towards recovery, to actually start building on what we lost, which was conscience? Because I'm fearful that actually it's almost a situation of we'll take care of that once we've recovered. But that's what got us there in the first place.
Ken, do you want to have a go?
Well, that's a
tough question.
I don't think people yet broadly understand the crisis we're in. And I think until we understand the crisis we're in, people won't be ready to raise that deeper issue. I just think that's where we are at the moment. And so I think it's going to be some time before we get there. What we can see, I mean, people are thrashing around for hope. But in reality, if you look at this debt that's weighing down on us, you know that there's more trouble coming. You just have to know it. It's not around the corner. It's there. We just haven't gotten to it yet. And if we, you know, we read these books, black swans. What we actually need now are some white rabbits, right? We need some good news. One would be big technological innovation that could create a new, opportunity for global growth. Another could be, if we had, you know, a magic wand and we could wave it and say 5% annual inflation for the next decade, God, whoever could create that would, you know, they'd get 4 or 5 Nobel Prizes. There's some certainties here, however, and there is a geography to growth. I don't agree with that, Maria. The geography of growth is very clear. These 5 countries, China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and South Korea, they're going to create more new wealth in the decade through to 2016. So, you know, we're halfway there. Than the US, Canada, Euroland, the UK, and Japan combined. So we know where the growth is going to be in a world of diminished growth. We know the economies in the world that have basically better fundamentals and that have very strong, as we've heard from the minister and others on the panel, strong drivers of domestic demand. Right. What's interesting about these countries, and I think this comes to your question, and I'll stop there, is that these countries all have a model of growth where the state's role is much bigger than it has been in the West, under current ideology still is in the West, and it's a very legitimate role. And that, I think, is going to pose a real challenge in terms of developing a new, quote, ideology or a new consciousness to rebuild the economies of the developed world as we move through this decade.
I think that's a point that Trevor Manuel put on the table right at the beginning of this afternoon's session. Another lady right in the front here. I'm looking for that invention that Andy Sabo was talking about. Mike's coming down from the ceiling. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a question around Africa in general, and just bear with me on this one because I work with young people, and the messages that are coming across, if I was to go back and explain what I experienced here, is that the panel has been talking about Africa, and it almost feels like a country, while talking about India, about China, Russia, about Indonesia. And this concerns me because, on the other hand, we're having the message that externally, not enough has been researched in Africa to really know how to rate the different countries. Internally, we're being told that we ourselves in Africa and our countries are not gathering enough information, so we don't really know what's going on either. And then on the other hand, we hear that Africa is occupying a third of the whole of the Earth's surface, and at the same time we have 80% of the mineral wealth in the world. So what I'm trying to say with this is that we really have to be careful, because I feel that we're generalizing about a huge continent. And how then can those emerging countries within Africa who are among the 22 or the 20 plus who are rated highly, how can they figure? Where does Botswana fit in? Where does South Africa fit in? And for me, working with a younger set of people to try and explain the big challenges and the big issue that Africa seems to be, How do we deal with that? Because I really think we really need to, here in this room, change that mindset in order to be able to communicate around this continent and make it into the individual countries that it is. Yes.
Minister Davies, take that.
Yeah, I think the point that's being made is valid in terms of trying to combat what Mo Ibrahim told us earlier on, that there's sort of 3 horror stories and that's what everybody says is a generalization of the whole continent. I think that's where the point is valid. This is a continent of several countries and a number of them are well governed and have got success stories. I think that's the point. On the other hand, though, I do think that there is a reality to Africa as a united force and Africa as a continent. And that is that if we look at India and China, the size of the domestic markets in those countries is large. I mean, 1.3 billion, 1 billion people, respectively. The long-standing dilemma of Africa is that we're fragmented into quite large numbers of countries, each of which has got quite small populations and relatively small markets as a whole. So I think that even for those countries that are well governed and whatever, their future is inextricably linked with that of the neighbors and the rest of the continent. And I think that means that the imperative to promote regional integration is there. That, I think, is the point. So, for example, when we start talking about the grand FTA, the free trade area between SADC, COMESA, and the East African Community, that would put in place a free trade area from Cape to Cairo, 700 million people. That would be a very significant enlargement of the internal market. So in that respect, I do think that Africa has a shared and common destiny. And I think in that regard, it's not wrong to talk about Africa as a collective. And I mean, I think that also the whole thing is that then we can bring in some of the values and change the systems, because I think that the point that was made earlier is absolutely profound, that we cannot solve this crisis by simply returning to the way things were. I think that's absolutely clear. We've got to discover a new model. And I think together, as African countries, together with the countries of the South, where the dynamism is, there are real lessons there. They include the point that was made about a more profound role for the state in industrial development. I think that's absolutely profound and important.
I can take one more question as long as it's 1 sentence long. Otherwise, I'm going to get vuvuzelaed myself. 1 sentence, sir.
Coming from Greece, I want to say that in most cases you try to understand what the problem is instead of trying to solve it. This is for Vivatsan Reef. I did my PhD on mining in South Africa. Scientists try to understand how this reef, the Vivatsan Reef, has developed, while the engineers picked up all. Now, the most problems in Europe is because they delay making decisions. They try to understand what's happening.
Could we have a question?
Yeah,
please,
yes. The question is, how fast can you make decisions without wasting time for South Africa, without trying to understand what's happening, if you are ready to act now?
Well, I can try. The first thing to understand also about Greece is the reason you didn't see it coming as well as the other countries did is because it was hidden behind derivative conditions. Paper, which instead of shining light on facts, hid. Not only hid things, hid where there was nothing in the first place. That's why the first thing you need to do is let's have paper say what it's supposed to say. Because the whole thing about a global economy, which Ian was talking about, which has brought enormous wealth to the world, we have grown from 1960 until today more than we grew from the time of Jesus Christ until the Second World War. So it works, but the condition is that paper has to say what it means. I came into South Africa and my passport says what it means, that's why you could identify me. And you have now got international football working here because you're all playing with the same rules. And until in Africa you continue having different rules, and for each tribe a different rule, and for each province a different rule because we're unique, you're not going to get international football or globalization or wealth.
Ian, last word.
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 thoughts. One is, if we're talking about football, the teams that have gone home first are the European teams. What you really have to understand about football is when the ref blows a red card, you get off the field and you know what the rules are. And I think Africans are as capable of understanding those rules as anyone else. But the rules have to be understood, and we have to understand if it's the IMF or the BIS or whoever it is with international rules, everyone knows. And these rules were gamed by the system and by the banks, partly because they made the rules. The second point is never waste a good crisis. And the real tragedy of this crisis is going to be if we do come back in years to come and nothing's changed. I believe on the consciousness level and on the ethics level, there is change. If you see what's happening on BP, if you see what's happening on incentive structures, and if you see what's happening in terms of the anger of people, the inequality that's been created by this crisis, particularly in Europe and the rich countries, is enormous. We will not have a continual election of governments that allow this to happen again and again. I believe that that power of people and information will, in the end, make this a successful crisis in terms of changing the system.
Jan, you wanted one more?
Yeah, for Africa, I think this crisis is going to end up being very positive. There's all this trouble we're going to have over the rest of much of this decade. But if you think of it, the demand for natural resources is extremely powerful, and the growth dynamics in the world are going to keep that demand powerful. Second, we know that you can't just create natural resources out of thin air. So the supply side is not as elastic as a lot of people think. And thirdly, when you get into a massive debt crisis like this, we could all talk and analyze endlessly, but we will, in the end, follow the line of least resistance. And that line of least resistance is inflation. And so people are going to want to own more and more as we go through this decade, stuff that when it falls on your feet, it hurts, hard assets, and that's Africa.
Maria Ramos, Ian Goldin, Hernando de Soto, Ken Courtis, and I'll go last. Minister Rob Davies, thank you all very, very much. Terrific.
Thank you.
Terrific session. Jeff Colvin is now coming on and will now explain to you what you need to know about the welcoming reception and how transportation will be organized for dinner.
Yes, indeed, and it won't take long, I'm happy to say. Thank you all. There's a couple things you need to know. Tonight we are going to have dinner not in a big room like this, but in the homes, the private homes of some of the most distinguished citizens of Cape Town. Wonderful idea. Yes, but if you think that staging the World Cup in 10 stadiums in 9 different cities is complicated, the logistics of moving 400 of us into 18 private homes around Cape Town is really complicated. So, in just a minute, we're going to leave this room and go to a reception just outside the room. When you get there, go down the hall that way. This is the most important thing, and you'll find some tables with cards. Okay, find the card for you to tell you what home you're going to. You'll find a card that has a number between 1 and 18, all right? Hang on to that card because it'll tell you which vehicle to board, and you will need the card in order to board the vehicle. Then, once you've got the card, that's the most important thing, enjoy the reception. When the time comes, there will be an announcement saying, okay, it's time now to go on to the vehicles. When you are done with dinner at the home you go to, there will be transportation taking you back to your hotel, if you're in one of our 3 headquarters hotels, or bringing you back here to the convention center if you like. There will be transportation to all those places. And if you have any questions about this arrangement, fortunately, there is lots and lots of staff out there to answer your questions for you. Okay? We're done in here for now. Let's go have the reception.